Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the National Foundation for Educational Research and the Royal Statistical Society, I wanted to welcome you all to this event. And today we're celebrating the centenary of the first recorded randomised controlled trial in education. And as Tom said, we have been delighted at the level of interest in today's event, and we have some great speakers lined up to talk about the context, strengths and challenges in undertaking RCTs, so I know that you won't be disappointed. Now, researchers have a range of tools at their disposal to evaluate the impact of interventions, and these have become increasingly sophisticated over time. And that includes robust qualitative research. I mentioned that word in the RSS. It includes regression, discontinuity and interrupted time series analysis, as well as a whole range of statistical techniques that we can use to analyse the national pupil database and the rich data sets that we have in education. But RCTs have long been considered the gold standard for evaluating outcomes across a number of fields, from medicine to education. They're particularly valuable in social science research because we never have all of the data on the variables, the factors that might be driving outcomes. Randomly assigning participants to either an intervention or a control group removes that selection bias and gives us greater certainty that the results are actually caused by the intervention rather than any other factors that we can't observe. It's also important that the trials themselves are accompanied by good quality process evaluations so that we can understand how the intervention has been implemented in practice, whether it has been implemented with fidelity, and what challenges may have arisen. NFER's Education Trials Unit was established 6 years ago by my predecessor, Sue Roster, who's been able to join us today. And we recognise that our mix of statistical, operational and process research expertise was particularly suited to undertaking RCTs. Since then, we've completed 19 RCTs and have another 10 in progress, working with a number of different organisations. The past decade has seen a very significant increase in the use of RCTs in the UK to evaluate what works in education. And this, of course, has been helped enormously by the creation of the Education Endowment Foundation and its focus on building a high-quality evidence base to inform practice and policy. Prior to 2012, evaluations were often commissioned after programmes had started, making it difficult to establish a baseline, let alone actually conduct any randomisation. And as the director responsible for research at the Department for Education at the time, I played a small part in helping to establish the EEF. But I never anticipated what a powerful role it would play in promoting the use of RCTs and in developing the underpinning science and methods. And it's certainly not straightforward to transplant the techniques used in health into education. And there is a whole question about methods development, as Tom alluded to. Plus, RCTs have their limitations. Researchers have had to tackle issues around ensuring trials are sufficiently powered or have a large enough sample size, whether to randomise at school or pupil level, how to interpret effect sizes, and how to avoid contamination. There are also debates about the generalisability or transferability of the findings from RCTs. And Ben Stiles, who heads up our trials unit, will be talking more about quality in RCTs later this afternoon. With the first education RCT a century ago and around 150 trials commissioned in England in just the last 7 years, this is an opportune time to celebrate, take stock, and ask whether things can be done better. Today we're joined by leading figures in the field of education research to address the key challenges faced by education trials today. We'll start the afternoon with 4 presentations regarding the history of RCTs in education, and our speakers include highly experienced trialists, the first person to start meta-analysing the new influx of education trials, and the leading commissioner of education trials in England. After the break, we'll be focusing on the future and how results are used, featuring speakers who generate, summarise and actually use the evidence. And they'll highlight the strengths of RCTs as well as suggesting improvements. Finally, the panel session will aim to distill the most important messages for the future so that we can refer back to this meeting as a record of how we can improve the science and use of RCTs going forward. And two final points from me before we bring on our speakers. First of all, I wanted to stress something that I hope everybody in this room will know already, that a finding of no effect from a trial, or indeed other sources of education research, is as important as a finding of impact. Those kinds of trials add to our understanding about what doesn't work, what initiatives should be avoided or dropped, and can enable scarce resources to be used more effectively. And finally, we owe a huge debt of thanks to all of the schools and other participants who volunteer to take part in education trials and other research. They give up their valuable time amongst so many other pressures on their day job to help us explore how we can improve our education system. So I sincerely hope you all enjoy today's event. Please do join us for the drinks reception later this evening after the event. If you're tweeting, please use the rather long hashtag up on the screen, EducationRCTs100. And now I'd like to welcome Professor Carole Torgerson, who's going to talk to us about the history and the future of randomised controlled trials in education. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the RSS and the NFER for inviting me to present today. I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the celebration of 100 years since the first recorded RCT in education. Or should it be 88 years? We will return to this question. My brief history of RCTs in education will focus on the theme of randomisation itself. Robert Alexander Cummings' monograph, Improvement and the Distribution of Practice, was published in 1919. And this reports a series of pragmatic experiments undertaken at the Teachers' College in Columbia University, comparing practice periods equal in length with practice periods reducing in length. And this was with children and adults in authentic settings in various subjects, for example, history and maths. One of these experiments, the Ohio experiment, was uncovered by Larry Hedges and Jake Schauer and described in their article, Randomised Trials in the USA, as the first recorded RCT. This is one of 6 articles on methodological debates, challenges and questions about RCTs, which was published in the special issue last year of the Education Research Journal, which Ben and I guest edited. And Hedges and Schauer, in their article, give us a succinct overview of the history of educational trials in the US. And this is from the first recorded RCT, the 1919 Cummings RCT, through 5 historical periods to the state of the art at the present day. And we will return to some of their observations. Before we continue the brief history of RCTs in education, I hope you will permit an even briefer digression into a personal history. So it's 13 years since I published my first RCT, undertaken with colleagues at the universities of Sheffield and York. And this RCT evaluated the effectiveness of a computer package for teaching spelling. Our manuscript was rejected by at least 2 editors because, as they said, their readership would have no interest in the negative findings of the study. And also, the developer of the programme hinted at legal action should we dare to publish the negative results. Well, I will just say, as Sir Ian Chalmers is in the audience, we're very privileged to have you here, Ian, that when I found that out, I was so shocked. And at that time, you were my mentor, and I phoned you up in a panic, and you reassured me that, you know, we had a protocol, that everybody had signed up to the protocol, and I had nothing to worry about. So I'll thank you again for that now. Since then, I've been involved in a little over 40 RCTs in education. 3 were funded by the DFE at the time when Carole was the Chief Scientific Advisor. 16 have been funded by the EEF, the greatest number, and the remaining 20 or so by various other bodies. This first one, however, was unfunded. In calling for more education RCTs in the UK around 20 years ago, a little before I started the first RCT, and you can see it took almost 6 years to get the article published, I encountered apathy, antipathy from some colleagues in the research community, hostile to the very idea of doing RCTs in education. They said things like, well, it's impossible to do an RCT in education, or it's unethical to do an RCT in education. So we will return to some early milestones in the history of RCTs in a little more detail, in particular, possibly the first pragmatic experiment in education by Henry Pearson, possibly the first randomised experiment in education by Cummings, and some key methodological milestones. And last week, Stevensons reminded us that in 2019 we are celebrating another significant centenary in the history of RCTs. This year it's 100 years since Fisher started to develop his theory of experimentation and randomisation. And also, although McCall's textbook on the design of experiments, educational experiments, does mention randomisation, it also discusses in more detail matching, which seems to be the preferred method at that time for forming groups. And a lot of the early pragmatic experiments actually used matching, as they believed this was superior to any other method. We'll also look in detail at another contender for the first RCT in education, Jack Walter's counselling experiment of 1931 and his replication trial of the following year. And as, again, as Ian's here, I will just mention that I don't know if you can see there, the counselling experiment was uncovered by Fawcett, Chalmers et al. In their systematic search for randomised controlled trials in education. It seems apt that Lindquist first outlined the framework for cluster randomisation in education, with the correct analysis being by cluster means. And as an aside, it's interesting to note that the 2 landmark RCTs in health, the antibiotic Patolin trial of 1944 and the more famous 1948 streptomycin trial, were preceded by at least 8 RCTs in education and the social sciences. So, back to what I think may be the first pragmatic experiment in education. As far back as 1911, Pearson was calling for a kind of experimentation which was pragmatic rather than explanatory, because the chief defect of the laboratory experiment, he believed, was that it isolates from its natural setting the issue to be tested, and should instead be surrounded by the normal accompaniments of its classroom setting. This was a cluster trial, although it was analysed at the level of pupil. However, teacher effect was acknowledged as early back as 1911, and a replication trial was undertaken and published in the same paper. Now we will return to the Cummings 1919 trial, which we are celebrating today. A careful reading of the chapter in the monograph reveals 3 pieces of evidence about the method of allocation to intervention and control groups. The first method of random selection is on page 51, as cited in Hedges and Shower's article, the factor of the teacher was equalised by a random selection of the classes which made up the two groups. This could mean that the classes were randomised, or the teachers were randomised to the classes, or the classes in the sample were a random sample of classes from the schools. Cummings then discusses the issue of lack of baseline in the factor of previous training and states the random method of selecting the pupils would tend to favour one group as much as the other. This seems to suggest that the pupils are randomised, which seems unlikely. But it could mean that the pupils were a random sample of the pupils in the school because the classes were a random sample of the classes in the school. See the previous quotation. However, on the previous page, evidence not cited in Hedges and Shower's article, but by inference, the information used to lead to their conclusion that randomisation was at the level of school, the equal and reducing groups were made up from the pupils of the 7 villages as follows. The equal group included all the classes at Rocky Ridge, Lakeside and Greenwich, and grades 3, 5 and 7 from Oak Harbour. The reducing group included grades 6 and 8 from Oak Harbour and all the classes at Elmore, Waterville and Weston. This could mean that the randomisation was at the level of the school, although the word random is not used here, and only 6 of the 7 schools could have been randomised at this level. The other school would have to have been randomised at the level of the class. I conclude, therefore, that we can't be sure that this is a RCT. From my reading and on the balance of probabilities, I don't think it is. Let us turn to another of Cummings' experiments, where he uses the phrase pupils taken at random as ours were to justify the assumption that one factor at baseline was equalised. Previous practice, in comparing pupils of the same grade taken at random as ours were, it would seem fair to suppose, for example, that 30 pupils in the 4th grade in one building would have had as much practice as had 31 pupils in the 4th grade in another building. We have then, for the equal group, classes E, F, G, H, I, and J. The reducing group includes classes A, B, C, D, and K. Is this randomisation of pupils, of classes? Why then are all but one in alphabetical order? Is this randomisation? Just a couple of notable characteristics of the Lyndhurst experiments. We learn on page 12 that intention to treat analysis was not used. And in this experiment, Cummings appears to have taken 2 groups unequal. I think it's Cummings. Sorry. So, in this experiment, Cummings appears to have taken 2 groups unequal on one factor and used a method of removing outliers to equalise the groups on this factor, initial ability, and he calls this the pairing off method. But if he had randomised, why would he need this pairing off method to equalise the groups? Now, we will return to what I believe is the first RCT in education, Jack Walter's first counselling experiment, which was undertaken in the School of Mechanical Engineering at Purdue University in 1931. Walters randomised members of the freshman class, delivered by 5 seniors with a good scholarship record, pleasing personality, excellent health and fine social environment, or to a control condition, and then measured academic outcomes. Walters used the term random sampling to form equivalent groups from the 220 freshman students, but it's absolutely clear in this article that this was indeed randomisation. And Walters also included probably what is the first economic evaluation in this RCT. Is this the first RCT in education? From my reading and on the balance of probabilities, I don't know if you're allowed to say that in the RSS, but I think it is. The following year, Walters undertook a replication trial with a much larger sample, 994, and random allocation, random sampling, to one of three arms: mentoring by seniors, mentoring by faculty members, and control condition. And incidentally, it turns out that the mentoring by the seniors was more effective than the mentoring by the faculty members. But another key characteristic of this trial is that it includes a process evaluation. And I think this is the first process evaluation in an education trial. And the impact and process outcomes differ. In fact, they contradict each other. So the mentoring by seniors was more effective than mentoring by faculty members, but in all the process outcomes, the mentoring by faculty members was perceived to be much better. They also report, or he also reports, uncertainty in his results, and there's the first subgroup analysis in an RCT. So he looks at different characteristics in terms of failing to thrive and how the outcomes are different for them. Several other RCTs followed, including Walter's 1933 trial of the efficacy of examinations for undergraduate students. The first of Hedges and Shower's 5 historical periods covered the period of Pearson's, Cummings, and Walter's early experiments, all of which were pragmatic, although most RCTs in this period were laboratory experiments. The second period was the first flowering of RCTs in the US and included many examples of pragmatic trials. The one I've used to illustrate this is the high-scope Perry preschool study, which is interesting because it was highly influential, but really had a rather small sample size, 123. And there are 3 violations of the randomization which are reported. We also have the development of theory of quasi-experimentation, experimentation by Stanley and Campbell, Cook and Campbell, and then later in 2002, Shadish, Cook and Campbell. And the 1967 seminal paper on explanatory and pragmatic trials by Schwartz and Lelouch was widely considered at this time to be the first time this issue had been considered in the methodological literature. But this was quite a number of years after the early pragmatic trials in education. There was a dearth of high-quality RCTs in education, but again, there were notable examples, and the example I've given is of a series of initial teaching alphabet trials that were done by the reading research unit at the Institute of Education. And it's interesting that their first trial in 1964 was criticised because it was a quasi-experiment. And so they then did another experiment the next year when they did a randomised experiment. And they also, they had 2 classes in each school, each of 16 schools. One was randomly allocated to the intervention and the other to the control. And they also randomly allocated the teacher. So they tried to do something about teacher effect. And they also tried to minimize contamination between the classes. So the last 20 years of the 20th century ushered in a dark period for educational trials in the US and the UK. And this was the time of the paradigm wars and scepticism about the design, although there are colleagues who were still undertaking randomized trials in the UK at this time. One of the most striking developments highlighted in Hedges and Shower's paper is the almost complete abandonment of experimental research in the US in this time. And this goes back to what Carole said at the beginning, actually, because this move away from the experimenting society of the 1960s and 70s was driven largely by the absence of treatment effects from the early trials, from most of these interventions that were evaluated. However, I would echo what you said, Carole, and say that rigorous evidence of no effect, or indeed of harm, of educational interventions is not a failure of the design used to evaluate it. Instead, it gives us precious, hard-won knowledge that the intervention is either ineffective or has negligible benefits in relation to the costs. And this is particularly where the intervention is in widespread use already. So, over the last decade, and after a 20 or 30-year lull in activity, the political and research scenes have changed beyond recognition. There's been a resurgence in the use of randomised trials to inform education policy. For example, in the US, under George Bush, the Institute of Educational Sciences was set up actually by legislation. If you can see the 107th Congress here, scientifically valid education evaluation employs experimental designs using random assignment when feasible and other research methodologies that allow for the strongest possible causal inference when random assignment is not feasible. And recently in the United Kingdom, there's been an upsurge in policy interest in the use of randomised trials in education. In 2009, following RCTs being sponsored by some government departments, for example, the Department of Work and Pensions, a House of Commons Select Committee was highly critical of the DFE for not supporting RCTs more widely in its evaluation of the new education policies, but did acknowledge the pioneering Every Child Counts trial, which the DFE funded, again during your time, Carole, and which is, we understand, the first ever DFE-funded curriculum evaluation using RCT design. And then in 2011, the EEF began, the Education Endowment Foundation began an impressive programme of evaluation of interventions targeting disadvantaged children using rigorous RCT designs. And you can see that the EEF says all EEF-funded projects are independently and rigorously evaluated. The impact of projects on attainment will be evaluated where possible using randomised controlled trials. And actually speaking to Millie just before the start of this afternoon's presentations, I realised that my statistics, which I thought were up to date, which I found out last week, are already out of date. So I thought it was 152 trials, but it may be as many as 155. And 96 have been completed. And actually, what a privilege it is to be part of this, what I think is the most important thing that has happened in education research in my career. So I'm going to conclude now. Experimental designs, which we have long associated with health, were under development in education decades preceding the key health trials. Indeed, the method of adjusting for cluster randomization described in 1940 was not widely adopted into the health trials analyses until the 1990s or later. And finally, I realise, spoken almost exclusively about the history, but I do have 3 challenges for the future. Firstly, encouraging funders and researchers to ensure randomisation conducted and reported to consort standards. Many, but not all, recent educational trials are adopting the consort statement, which ensures transparency of methods, particularly of randomisation, as this will minimise misinterpretation. If only we'd had the consort statement in 1919. Secondly, explaining randomisation to all participants, partners, collaborators to facilitate acceptability. It can be challenging to explain to people who are otherwise very sophisticated in their lives, in their work, the complexity and the implications of randomisation. For example, the participants may be randomised to the control group and can't switch by preference. And this may hinder recruitment, but it also, on the other hand, should improve retention. And I hope I have just a couple of minutes to mention a personal anecdote in this respect. And this happened in 1992 when I was expecting my son, and I was at the first booking appointment and recruited into a randomised controlled trial. Well, actually, I said I'd think about it, and I went home and spoke to David Torgerson and said, well, I didn't know anything about trials at this time. I had heard of them, but I didn't know much about it. And I said, do you think I should be in this trial? And he said, well, put it like this. He said, if you want to be a single mother, you might say no. So anyway, so at the next booking appointment, the booking nurse was going to tell me my random allocation. And she said to me, well, which would you prefer? Would you prefer to be in the midwives unit for delivery or in the gynecology and obstetrics ward? And I didn't know that she shouldn't have asked me that question, and I also didn't know I shouldn't have answered it, but I did answer it, and I said, well, I would prefer to be in the midwives unit. And she said, oh, well, that's really good because that's what you are in. And she then took the top envelope from one of 2 piles of envelopes. And I have actually checked the write-up of this RCT, and that's not what it says in the write-up. And thirdly, ensuring strict adherence to randomisation. If randomisation isn't adhered to, at the least worst, it can lead to a dilution of effect in the ITT analysis. And at worst, it can lead to bias if the ITT analysis is not respected. So, I would just like to, before I finish, I would like to acknowledge everybody involved in the special issue of the Education Research Journal, in particular Frances, who was the editor who worked with Ben and I don't think we could have done this issue without her. And of course this led to Larry Hedges in covering the first randomised trial, which we're celebrating. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank as well all my collaborators and co-authors on the RCTs that I've been involved in. Finally, I hope to see you all in 12 years' time to celebrate the real 100th anniversary of RCTs in education. And I'd be very happy, Ben and Tom, to contribute if you feel like organising it.
Okay, again, I want to start, as Carole did, by thanking the RSS and NFER for organising this event, and absolutely privileged and delighted to be here and speaking at this event, which is celebrating 100 years, give or take, of RCTs in education. And what I want to do is to focus really on the opportunities and the challenges of doing RCTs in education, particularly pragmatic trials. I'll draw upon my experience. I'll draw upon my experience establishing and leading the Centre for Evidence and Social Innovation at Queen's. We've done over 50 pragmatic trials now, many in education, but some in social care and public health. So to draw upon that experience, but also the findings of a systematic review which we conducted a couple of years ago, looking at RCTs in education over the period 1980 to 2016, and looking at what does the actual evidence tell us about the conduct of RCTs during that whole period. And at the end of my slides is a reference to the article, but actually it's great because I think you've all got a copy. It's in this special edition, so it should be on your seats. So I want to sort of use that as well, pull out some of that evidence, but really use it as a springboard into looking at some of the challenges and issues that we have to address. So I'm talking or presenting this talk as a professor of education. I was a head of a school of education at Queen's for a number of years. A lot of my professional life has been working in the field of education with educational researchers and teachers. So I'm going to really be speaking, when I talk about the challenges which have been raised in that type of context for me, not as a statistician, therefore, but as an educationalist. And I'm not going to read through this quote here, but you can have a read of it as I'm talking. And this level of resistance that you can see from this article to randomised control trials is still, I'm afraid to say, prevalent in education. I was at the British Education Research Association conference just 2 weeks ago, and the same tired old arguments are being rehearsed about the fact that you can't do randomised trials in education, but it is unethical, but it doesn't make any sense, but you're trying to ape the natural sciences, and education is just so much more complex, and you can't control for all these different things. So you see some of the arguments here. If you're not an educationalist, you wouldn't be aware that this is the main education methods textbook in the UK. So this is what we're teaching our next generation of graduate students about randomised trials. And I came to the conclusion that really it's an ideological resistance. We have really a paradigm war. We talked about the paradigm wars going back, but there's still, I come from Northern Ireland, so you can tell that there's conflicts, it hasn't gone away, and the paradigm wars haven't gone away. And there's still this prevalent discourse which sets up two discursive positions and pits them up against each other. One is a body of people who are doing research for practitioners, who are into qualitative research, into inclusion and being emancipatory, into being theoretically informed, and they are pitted against this construction of us doing randomised trials, who are against practitioners, against teachers, against professional autonomy, only interested in large-scale quantitative trials, dictatorial, descriptive, theoretically naive. And you can go on, and I've written about this elsewhere. What you can do, though, when you look at all of these arguments, and I can tell you there's many of them, and they're still coming through the literature, you can distill the arguments down. And this is really my starting point, to 4 key challenges. And we've already heard a few of these. And really, when you look at all of these different arguments, they come down to 4 things. Firstly, you just can't do randomised trials in education. It's just not possible. Secondly, RCTs ignore context and experience. Again, this sort of notion that we work in a laboratory, that you're not really studying the real world of classrooms, of children, of messy relationships. So it ignores context and experience. The RCTs are just about developing universal laws of cause and effect that operate in all circumstances, at any time, at any place. And that randomised trials are inherently descriptive, that they add very little to theory. So those are, when you really look through all the debates that have gone on in the education research community, those are the 4 big charges against those of us who do trials. We can just reframe those now as challenges, and those are the challenges that I want to talk about. And because it was so prevalent, because every time we talked about doing randomised trials and we did presentations, there would always be some person or two in the audience who had a smug smile on their face. They put their hand up and they would ask the same things about, well, how can you do this? What about the ethics of what you're doing? And so on, as if nobody's ever mentioned these things before. So I thought, well, let's have a look at the evidence. These are the things we get charged with time and again. So let's see what actually is the evidence in practice. So this is really what's in that special issue that you've got. It's a systematic review which we undertook, where we undertook a systematic review of tried to identify all randomised control trials in education that have been reported between 1980 and 2016. The article itself, if you're flicking through, you'll see all the details around the search criteria, not just the sort of published literature, but the grey literature as well. But our definitions of inclusion were very strict, so we didn't want to be seen as counting stuff which people would dispute as being educational research or trials. So we only included studies which were proper randomised trials, either individual or cluster randomised. We only focused on evaluations of programmes that took place in educational institutions, and only if that programme had at least one key educational outcome that was being tested. So all of the figures that we'll report now and so on will be a very conservative underestimate of the actual number of trials that are out there, because we didn't look at after-school programs which weren't related to or run through schools, a whole range of different sort of tutoring programs and so on, which may have happened outside of educational establishments, and so on and so on. And of course, that's even before you get to quasi-experimental designs. So, in terms of our systematic review itself, you'll see, as always, you start off with a very large number and you work your way through, and it's absolutely it's tough going through sort of reviews like this. But you'll see the sort of the flow chart of, we start with 10,000 or so studies which we identified, screened them, checked them for eligibility, did sort of full text sort of screening and so on, and we ended up with just over 1,000 RCTs which were reported in education between the period 1980 and 2000 and the end of 2016. So that's our estimate of the number, and as I said, it's a conservative estimate, but we've found at least 1,017 unique randomised controlled trials reported in education across the world. And again, this is only the English-speaking world. It was the literature which we searched. So I'm not going to go through in much detail, but just to give you a sense overall of what these 1,000 trials look like, well, you can see, and this sort of backs up some of the earlier talks from Carole, that there's been a big surge, and this should be to 2016 rather than 15, but there's been a big surge of trials in the last 10 years. 58% cluster randomised trials, and fairly decent sized trials as well. So about a quarter of all the trials reported in this period had samples of over 1,000 participants. If we look at where the trials were conducted, and again, probably very much reflecting the history of where we've got to, but the clear majority published in the USA and Canada, about a third in Europe, and roughly equal numbers in the UK, Ireland, and the rest of Europe within that. If we look at the types of educational institutions where the trials were conducted, about 2/3 were conducted in compulsory education in primary or secondary schools. About 1 in 5 undertaken in colleges or universities. And interestingly, from my own perspective, my interest in early childhood research, are the very small numbers still in preschools, given our focus on early intervention and prevention, and some of the landmark studies that Carole had mentioned, the Perry Preschool projects and others. If we look at the duration of a study as well, of the trials that have taken place, about a third of all the trials reported ran for at least one academic year or more. 2/3 ran for at least half a term or longer. So most of the trials were fairly substantial. They were not just quick 1 week, 2 week experiments. They did have a sort of a lifespan. And then if we look at the primary outcomes that were tested, a whole range of outcomes across these studies. And you'll see, putting together some of these categories, about a third of the trials, the primary outcomes were educational outcomes, whether that's literacy or numeracy or other academic outcomes. So that's just a quick sort of summary of our descriptive systematic review of trials. But we went through all of that, if you remember, because of those 4 charges which were made against doing trials. So let's go back to those. So what does all that tell us about, and how does it give us any influence or new light to address some of these sort of 4 criticisms? Well, first of all, is it possible to do RCTs in education? Well, yes, of course. 1,000 have been done so far. And I don't know anybody else that goes to education conferences. I'm sure you still get people telling you can't do randomised controlled trials in education. So that's still a myth, which is pushed forward. So clearly we can do randomised controlled trials, and what we've shown with these over 1,000 trials to date, which we've identified since 1980, they can take place in a whole range of different contexts, addressing a whole range of outcomes, a whole range of different research designs. So secondly, then the next argument was, well, RCTs ignore context, ignore experience. And some of the other findings, and you'll find it in the paper, but what we found was nearly half, 49% of trials reported some subgroup analysis. 31% reported some qualitative findings. Another further 7% had gathered qualitative data but hadn't reported it. So what we see here is that RCTs, if well designed, and they have specified subgroup analyses, if they have a qualitative component process evaluation going alongside, they can begin to address issues of context and experience. It's not just a black box of the intervention or not, and what is the overall outcome. We can start to sort of dig in there and look at the influence of context or of background or of individual characteristics or school level characteristics or program characteristics. The third charge was that RCTs simply generate universal laws of cause and effect. And again, the fact that nearly half of the trials had some subgroup analyses in them showed that half of the trialists were very clear that they were looking for the potential that a particular program may have differential effects for particular groups or in particular contexts. A large proportion, which was encouraging to see, 78% of those studies which were reported, of those 1,000 trials, discussed very explicitly and clearly the limitations to generalizability. So they were very aware of the fact that they're not looking at universal laws, that the trials that are done, there is an issue of external validity and how far you can generalize from what you've got. People are very careful, have been very careful in doing that. And then there's the argument that, well, RCTs are just inherently descriptive, they're atheoretical, they're just about what works, with no sense of why or understanding why. And again, what we found was that 35% of studies explicitly identified and discussed a theory or a theorist as underpinning the program that they were evaluating. A further 43% discussed a theory of change, descriptive theory of change. So again, it's not that trials are just fundamentally atheoretical. It is quite possible to do trials and have a very well thought through theory of change and have that inform your design, your selection of outcomes, the processes that you measure and you explore through the trial. So on the one hand, those four arguments are knocked down, that we're told we can't do those four things, or four things are happening across the board. They are fundamental limitations of trials, and what we've found quite clearly are significant proportions of those who have done trials, of trials that have been reported, which actually show that these things are possible. But here's where the challenge becomes now, because it's not all positive as a story. We just look at these figures and turn them on their head, and we see that we've got a lot still to do. So 51% of trials published till the end of 2016 had no subgroup analysis. So they just looked at the programme as a whole, with no sense or no question around its potential differential effects. 62% of all the trials reported to the end of 2016 had no qualitative process evaluations. 65% of those trials, 2/3, had no explicit theory of change. And 57%, the majority, didn't even discuss a descriptive logic model or theory of change underpinning the programme that they were evaluating. So it's always about whether a glass is half full or half empty. I think that the point here really is that what we've tried to do, and it was addressing a particular concern and discourse within educational research around the fundamental problems of RCTs, and I think what we've shown clearly is that RCTs fundamentally are not the problem, it's just how we do them and how we take them forward, and all of the issues about theory, about context and so on, which are levelled at as criticisms, are things that can be addressed. But with a glass half empty, what we also see is that a lot of people doing trials at the moment are not addressing those or haven't addressed those historically. So it's still a challenge for us. So as interim conclusions, this is a sort of penultimate slide. I think what we're seeing from this sort of review of trials is that the use of RCTs is growing rapidly, and we've seen some of the context for that in the United States, the Institute for Education Sciences and the Education Endowment Foundation here in the UK. So we're seeing a welcome growth, a rapid growth of randomised trials now coming through the system. It's clearly evident that those 4 criticisms of trials are not fundamental criticisms, and we can address those to varying degrees, but it's also clear from what we've seen that much more still needs to be done. If we are ever to move beyond a simplistic what works question to the broader question which all of us are asking now about, well, what works for who, in what circumstances and under what conditions and in what contexts. And this leads me then to future challenges. And 5 of them, and I think some of these have already been raised in different ways through some of the introductory remarks and the first talk today. But I think there is a huge, and speaking again from somebody from the education research community, there is a huge amount of work still to be done in terms of raising the awareness and understanding of trials in the education research community. If we still have our major textbooks saying the sorts of things as we saw at that early slide, then it's no wonder that we still have those conversations at conferences where people still tell me that I can't do trials. It's just impossible to do trials. So there's significant work to be done, and it's not just about training of future educational researchers, it's the training of our future generation of teachers, going through doing teacher training and just their professional development. It's one thing if we can generate more trials, but it's another that we need an intelligent audience in the education, in schools and education community who can understand and interpret them well. So there is a huge amount of work still to be done there. Secondly, there is a need for meaningful qualitative components that run alongside and are integrated properly with trials, that engage with theory, that allow us to better understand some of the quantitative findings which come out. So if we see from our exploratory analysis some interesting subgroup effects, we do need to dig deeper, to look at the context, to have some qualitative work, really sort of interrogating that and beginning to hypothesize why those things are happening. And that just generates more research questions and more starting points for future work. The third challenge, and this is really speaking particularly to the education research community, is that we do need to move away from the culture which is still predominant in education of lone researchers, individual action research projects of individual teachers in classrooms doing their own individual studies with a very small group. And that type of work is very important and can lead to some profound insights. But what it does is it atomizes our educational researchers. And what we need to do is to begin encouraging people to, yes, carry on doing that type of work, but also be involved in larger interdisciplinary teams. If you're a maths educator, been teaching 20 years on the PGCE and so on, have some brilliant insights and experience and track record in maths education, that's excellent, but actually bring that to the table, bring that to a research team where you've also got statisticians and psychologists and so on, where we can work together. You can bring that expertise to the table and work together. So that's a cultural change, but a very important one, because if we don't start encouraging much more a focus on teamwork and disciplinary working, we're going to make limited gains in terms of educational research. We obviously need more collaboration with key stakeholders. I know that's a big thing for the Education Endowment Foundation. It's a big thing we've tried to be pursuing at Queen's and elsewhere. Most of us are now doing that. And it's all the different reasons why collaboration is important, because it keeps it real in terms of the types of work that you're doing, the research questions you're asking. They're addressing real world problems because you're working in genuine partnership with those externally. But also some of the things, I mean, Carole's point around explaining why randomisation is so important. You know, you have to have those conversations. And what we've found, again and again, working with a wide range of schools and communities and local organisations, is that most don't understand randomisation, but if you take the time and you work in partnership, they get it. and they get it very clearly and fully understand why you need that. So collaboration is important also for dissemination, for knowledge exchange, and actually taking any findings that you do have and actually making them meaningful in terms of policy and practice. And the last thing I'd want to say, just in terms of with a hat on of being the founding director of the Campbell UK and Ireland Centre, hosted at Queen's, is the importance of evidence synthesis. I think we have got a growing ability now, potential with the number of trials which are coming through. We've identified 1,000 there, but if we start to include quasi-experimental designs and we add on the another couple of hundred which have happened since this review was done, we've got a big evidence base now. And more then we can we have enough good quality primary studies to begin doing systematic reviews, doing meta-analyses, which can begin to unlock some of those questions, not just of what works, but also then with the types of meta-analysis techniques we have, beginning to look at, well, what works better, in what context, for what groups, under what circumstances. So we can start to unpick that type of work. And then the actual article, there it goes, but it's on your chairs. So there you go. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Hugo, and I'm a lecturer at the University of York. I want to thank the RSS and the NFER to invite me here. I feel very privileged to be able to speak with all these great researchers. And also, I want to say I'm not a statistician. I don't have the experience that the speaker here have about educational trial, but I've spent a lot of time collecting and analyzing data, and I think some of you might be interested by what I found. I did this project in collaboration with Matthew Ingalls from Loughborough. So it's really a project we both work very hard on. And we started this project because we saw that there was a growing number of randomized control trials in the last 15 or 10 years. And these trials, well, you know, they test different interventions. So a teaching assistant, playing chess. So you're all familiar with that. And yeah, they are usually expensive. So we were wondering, there's a lot of money invested in these trials, and we were wondering, is it producing something that's valuable? Yeah, so it's important to reflect on how successful this kind of change of funding is going, so this increasing amount of funding. And to start our investigation, we focused on the effect sizes produced by the trials. So you know the effect size is a standardized measure of the magnitude of a phenomenon. I'll just push that here. And it's, if you look at a kind of a simple design of an RCT, it's how different the outcomes measure are in the intervention and in the control group. So you want the effect size to be as large as possible, so that would suggest that your intervention is very effective. And some people are familiar with the kind of effect size numbers that we see in RCT. So in social science, there are benchmarks for how to judge effect sizes. So you often see these benchmark, an effect size of 0.2 is a small effect size, an effect size of 0.5 is a medium, an effect size of 0.8 is large. We see that very often. It's from Jacob Cohen's in social science. And just to give you other kind of example of effect size, to give you an idea for people who are not familiar, who don't work all the time with that. People are usually familiar with the Key Stage 2 achievement test. So I took the math test of the Key Stage 2, and it's a standardized test that is on a score from 80 to 120. So students have a score between 80 and 120. And if you look how much increasing 1 point on that test is corresponds to an effect size of 0.14. So one single point, it's an effect size of 0.14. Another example that I have of effect size is from the TIMS. I don't know if some of you might be familiar with that. It's a test that's given to student in different countries to compare how good the countries are in terms of math achievement in that case. And you can compare different countries. And just for fun, I compare England with Singapore. Singapore was the best. They're always the best. But the difference in terms of effect size between the performance in maths of English student and a Singaporean student corresponds to an effect size of 0.84. So just to give you an idea. And then there's this other famous book that's often cited by John Hattie, which looked at many different interventions and ranked these interventions in how impactful they are in terms of effect sizes. And you can see these effect sizes, the kind of range. So there was providing formative evaluation. According to him, it's equal to an effect size of 0.9 and feedback 0.73. And even suggests in his book that we should pay attention to, teachers should pay attention to intervention that produce effect size greater than 0.4. So that's one of his conclusions. And the thing, so in that context, we were curious to see how large are effect sizes from a randomized control trial. Randomized control trial is, especially the ones done by the EEF, are extremely rigorous. There's a lot of procedure to make sure that they're very well done. And we kind of knew that the effect size in this trial would be smaller than what we typically see in the lab-based research in academia. Because, you know, these randomized control trials are very large compared to typical research studies. They use a very heterogeneous population. They try to have representative samples. They have an active control group, so it's not comparing the intervention to nothing, it's comparing the intervention to business as usual, so you would expect smaller effect. The outcome measures are standardized tests, so it's not a measure that's been developed to try to magnify the effect of the intervention. It's a measure that people care about. They use a pre-registered measure, so everything is pre-registered. So there's no p-hacking. There's no way to kind of change your analysis to make your effect look bigger, like people do in academic research. And also, there's no publication bias because everything is published. So really the cream of the crop in terms of methodology. And we were wondering, well, how large are the effect size observed in these RCTs? So to look at that, we look at all the report of the EF. We start with the EF, and it's really great. Everything is available online. So the EF started in 2011. It might be not very accurate, but that's, they conduct rigorous RCT. The majority of their trials are large, as I said before, multiple schools, relatively long intervention compared to what we often see in academia, which intervention might last 1 hour or 2 hours. Here it's very often 1 month or even 1 year. So, it's very expensive. So, yeah, as I said, we looked at all the trials that were completed at the time. So we had 82 randomized control trials. Some of them were testing more than a single outcome measure. So in total, we have 140 distinct effect sizes. And it's a total, at that time, now there's a little bit more RCTs that are completed, but at that time there was 790,000 students in all these trials. And it's a total of 37 million pounds. And we looked at, so here is all the effect size that we have that are sorted by school year. So you see that the majority of the trials are done at elementary school level, a little bit less at the secondary school level, very few at kindergarten, and some of them overlap between elementary school and secondary school. That just gives you an idea of the kind of descriptive statistics. For the topics, so you see that most of our FAcSS were from outcome measure that were about reading, a little bit less in maths, a little bit less in the general language, writing, few in science, and some of them in combination on different topics. So we just gather all the FAcSS of all these very rigorous trials together, and we compute a simple average. So what do you think is the average FAcSS of these very rigorous trials? Do you have, do you think 0? Oh, okay, well, pessimistic here. A little bit higher, maybe 0.1. Sometimes I hear 0.3, 0.2, 0.3. 0.4, oh, wow. So, I mean, there's slight variation depending how you compute the average, but here what we have is 0.06. So you see how small the impact is. You can remember the key stage 2. One additional point on the key stage 2 test was an FAcSS of 0.14. So it's very small. I'm not saying here that small FAcSS are meaningless, because scale and a large scale can have a very substantial impact. But I think it's good to keep that in mind, that FAcSS are very small. I can show you a histogram of all the trials, our 140 trials with their FAcSS. So you see most of them are scattered around 0. There's a few ones that are very effective, and some of them seems to be below 0. But you see the chunk of these FAcSS were very close to 0. And then I can show you John Hattie's 0.04 zone of developmental, like John Hattie was suggesting, oh, teachers should care about the FAcSS greater than 0.4. There's very few of them that reach that threshold. Yeah. That's true, I don't know. Hey, good job. I think I changed my mind at the last minute. So the red line is 0.25. Hey, good job, Tom. Yeah, so it would be even more impressive had I did that. So another thing that we did when we had all these FAcSS is to look at the the different factors that influence the FAcSS. So we had all these data. Maybe FAcSS are greater, are influenced by the age of the participant. Maybe it's easier to improve achievement of younger student than older student. We can look at maybe the topic of the intervention also have an influence on the impact. The cost of the intervention, maybe expensive intervention produce greater gain than cheaper one. The size of the trial, maybe larger trial produce smaller or larger. And the year the trial was conducted, maybe the EF is getting better at detecting good trials, or they tested all the low-hanging fruit first, and then the FAcSS would decrease over time. And before I start showing you the different findings related to that, I want to say that we've collected all these data, and we've put them all available online. So if you want, or you're interested by doing your own analysis, you should do that. We're very open to that. We already have people who analyze these data, and I think there's a lot of potential to do. And yeah, so I'll show you what we got. So if you look at the age of the participant, so that's just to remind you the distribution of FAcSS by age. So I'll show you now in the next slide a kind of a scatter plot where you will see all the every dot is an FAcSS. So on the y-axis you have the FAcSS, and on the x-axis you see the age group, and then you can see the distribution of FAcSS. The red dot is the average, and you can see that there's slight variation, but if you do a statistical test on that, there's no difference between the four groups. So that's with age. We did that with the topics also, just to remind you the different topics that we had. Maybe at the beginning I was thinking maybe FAcSS, maybe intervention trying to improve math will produce greater effect, because math is usually easier to measure, it's less subjective. But if you look at the data, then you see there's very little difference. There's one language writing seems to have higher effect size, but I think it's mostly driven by one trial that produced a very high effect size. But you see, it's very very flat. Yeah, my wife often say, oh, the trial that produced this massive effect size, is it a corporal punishment? No. But I'll show later, it's probably because the sample size was very small. It's in an extreme value. I can show you, yeah, there was no statistical difference here. The cost may be more expensive treatment, produced greater gain. In the sample of trials that we analyzed, we didn't see any effect. So the EF gives a measure of cost per student, and it's between $1 and $5 pound symbol. And you see there's no, well, the very expensive trial seems to be a little bit higher, but given that there were very few, there's no statistically significant trend there. And I also look at the effect size, whether a large trial were producing maybe larger or smaller effect sizes. And to do that, I did something that's very typical in meta-analysis called a funnel plot. Looks like this. So again, each point is an effect size. And you can see on the x-axis is the effect size, and on the y-axis is the sample size. And you see that the larger the sample size in the trial, the closer to 0 the effect size comes to. And you see that extreme effect sizes are only common in the very small trials. So that kind of suggests, one way to see that is maybe if we were taking this extreme trial at 0.76 and scale it up, then maybe the effect size would come closer and closer to 0. That's one possibility. Some people, when they see that, they start thinking is there a publication bias? I know Ben is very big on that. I don't think so. I mean, because that's often used to detect publication bias if it's not symmetrical. But I trust the EF is publishing all their trials. What else did we look at? Oh yeah, we looked at whether effect size were increasing or decreasing over time. So we looked at whether the effect size by different years. And you see there's a slight decrease. It's not exactly clear what it means. Because one way to see, what I think is the reason is that there's more and more efficacy trials, which are much larger trials, and they tend to produce smaller effect size. So that's why there's this kind of a decrease. And that decrease is statistically significant. So there's effect size seems to be, when we look at that data, effect size seems to be getting slightly smaller over time. So here I analyze the data from the EF, but we're not alone doing RCTs. And I looked at what do they do in US. So in US, there's an organization called the IES, which is also doing trials, very much like the EF. They have been starting since 2007, so they have done a little bit more. Yeah, so this is the trial, the different age level that they've been doing their trial at. So you see, just like with the EEF, most of their trials are testing elementary school student, a little bit less secondary school student. And here's the topic. Again, mostly reading, a little bit less of maths, very few science, a little bit of the rest. And just to remind you, so in the data set of the UK with the EEF, the average effect size was 0.06. So do you think in the data set of the US it's going to be higher or lower? Some people say, oh, US people, they're not good at it. The same. Yeah. Is it, some people might think lower in the back? The scale? You mean more heterogeneous or? Oh, the size. I'm not sure how this would, well, yeah, maybe there's more, I don't know, more variation in the population that could, yeah, that's possible. So you would predict smaller, I guess. Any people would predict higher, higher, higher. Okay, so the effect size was the same. You were right, Carole. Yeah, exactly the same. And if I plot the effect size on a histogram, it's very much like what we have with the EEF. So here I plot the two on top of each other, and you see it's very, very similar. Yeah, but the thing at this point that you might wonder is, okay, the effect sizes are small, and a lot of people have mentioned that small effect size, it's interesting in some way because it tells us not to invest our money in a specific intervention if it doesn't work. But do we know that it does not work? That's the thing, that's the key point of our paper, because let's say you have an effect size here, it's clear that it's above 0, it produces benefits and no harm. But effect size are not point estimate, they come with a range of uncertainty. And you might have an effect size with a small uncertainty around it, or an effect size with a large uncertainty. And that's the other key thing that we looked at. How large is the uncertainty surrounding the effect size in randomized controlled trials in education? And if you have an effect size like the second one, you see the uncertainty is very wide, and the finding of that trial is consistent both with an intervention producing an amazing effect size of 0.15 and an intervention producing an effect size that's negative, that may be harmful. So in that case, we wanted to see how large are the confidence interval produced in these trials. So we looked at all the confidence intervals. And just remember, the average effect size was 0.06. The size of the confidence interval was, on average, 0.3. So very wide confidence interval. So we had a lot of trials that were like the lower one, where you have a very wide confidence interval. And not surprisingly, a lot of the trials were not statistically significant. So only 23% of the trials show statistical significance, reach that threshold. How much time do I have? None? Oh, okay, okay. So I just want to very quickly finish with, I'll skip, we did another analysis about uncertainty just to support our findings. And the thing I want to say is trials often fail to provide evidence as to whether an intervention helped to boost achievement or not. So effect sizes are small, but doesn't mean that there's no effect. In fact, a lot of our trials are uninformative in the way that the uncertainty is so wide that it's consistent both with an intervention that works and with an intervention that does not work. So after the trial, we just don't really know whether we should use the intervention or not because there's too much uncertainty around these estimates. Am I done? Okay, thank you.